Hey guys, Mr. Vreeling here with our next psych video. This video is going to be talking about the general topic of antisocial relations. So this has to do with why we don't get along, or things that cause conflicts within groups or between groups or things like that. So social psychology does focus on both how being in groups affects our behavior, how the presence of others does certain things to our psyche, whether that's conformity or obedience. And it also talks about some of the negative ways that we treat each other, as well as the positive ways, which will be in a future video. So let's kind of dive right in to some of the kind of heavy topics of today's video. And that is talking about some of the major ways that we practice antisocial relationships, and that is through stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So, colloquially, we kind of use these terms interchangeably. And that's actually a mistake. So, we should make sure that we are clear with our definitions of words, okay? Um, so, a stereotype is really just a belief about a trait, it is a generalization that sometimes is positive, sometimes is negative. I can generalize that. I can have a stereotype that dogs have four legs, and for the most part, that is a correct stereotype. Obviously, there are individuals within the dog species that don't have four legs, but for the most part, those stereotypes help me organize my worldview. Same is true with negative stereotypes, right? So these are usually what we would call as a stereotype against another human person, right? So we kind of generalize people into larger groups. So a stereotype is a belief about a trait. Prejudice is a negative feeling towards a group of people. Um, so you can have with prejudice, you have these negative thoughts, right? These are these things that kind of have like these snap judgments, or that they have you just have like this belief or a feeling about other people that is in a negative way. So that's prejudice. Discrimination is behavior. That's probably the easiest line to draw. So, discrimination is something that almost always results in an action, right? So, not liking someone because of the color of their skin is a prejudiced thought. Believing that all blank is a stereotype, and then saying something along the lines of, like not hiring someone because of the color of their skin is discrimination. Um, we're going to kind of go into some of the specifics in class about how these things show up, but I want to kind of go over just some statistics here, so that we can kind of talk about how prejudiced are we as individuals in our society. Okay. So it's probably not a surprise that overt prejudice has waned, right? There's no longer a legal system of separate but equal, right? Jim Crow is gone, and what is called de jure segregation is no longer the case. That means by law. So, the law by definition now is colorblind. But that doesn't mean that racism is over, right? That doesn't mean that prejudice doesn't still exist. What we're finding now is that there are more subtle ways in which people show their prejudice. There's some statistics about being, discrepancies between what we say and what we do. So actually, it's closer to 90% in 2008 said that they would vote for a qualified woman candidate for president of the United States. That number was up from like 30% in the 1930s. So clearly, things are, at least in terms of what we say, are moving in the right direction. Obviously, we still have yet to have a woman president, regardless of recent elections and qualifications aside, right? If We have 90% of the population saying they would vote for a qualified woman. Does that just mean that women aren't qualified? That doesn't seem to be correct. So what else is at play here, right? What else is going on? Another kind of aspect with prejudice is something that's called driving while black. So, black Americans are more likely to be pulled over by police than white Americans for doing similar offenses, or even not any offenses at all. Um, there's a statistic that says that around 50% of black men, adolescents, whatever, adolescents through adulthood, 50% know at least one person who they would say was harassed or targeted unfairly by police officers. Now, I'm not saying that that means that all police are bad or anything like that. It's just saying that there's this a prejudice in our system that unfortunately targets people of color. And driving while black is just one instance of that, that is, documented in our statistical analysis of things. We also know about the gender pay gap. So women make, depending on the year, somewhere between 75 and 80% of what a man makes for similar jobs. We also know, in terms of sexism, that there are sex-selected abortions globally, where people find out that they're having a girl and they decide to abort the pregnancy. Same thing in typically poorer countries where you have maybe multiple kids and you don't have enough food to feed everybody, so you feed the son and not the girl or daughter. And globally speaking, just looking at rates of birth rates, the most recent number was around 100 million women were missing, that they should have been born, or they were born and then died in infancy at higher rates than the males were, right? So we see this kind of in play globally in relates to gender, but also in the United States. So this was an interesting statistic. So in 1941, U.S. couples were asked if you could only have one child, would you rather have a boy, a girl, or no preference? 2/3 in 1941 said that they would want a boy, right? So, they're kind of making a decision there, even though that seems to be a prejudiced decision. And you might say that's a long time ago, but we had the same exact percentage in the early 2000s when this test was done again. So, needless to say, we are fairly prejudiced in society, that there is, certain negative feelings that we have that are usually based on stereotypes, and that plays a role into how we view the world, right? How we interact with other people. And kind of oddly enough, and this is still a prejudice, right? This is still a prejudice, that most people feel more positively towards women when looked at individual faces. A face that has been feminized with softer features, people tend to like that face more, both men and women. And that's also true with a lot of these things, guys. There's been a ton of data on resumes that people with either white sounding names or black sounding names are more likely to get hired. People with white sounding names are more likely to get hired with exact same qualifications on the resume than a person of color or a person with a stereotypical black name. Same is true in science. There was a study done with resumes for a job on a college campus, and if the resume was the name John, they were more likely to get the job, have higher salaries, than if the name was Jennifer at the top. Again, everything else being exactly the same. And that was true even for the female science professors who were making this decision as females. They still preferred the male candidate, right? So when we talk about that these things are pervasive in our society, right, we mean that. Like, people who are affected by this still sometimes believe it. And that leads us to something that's really important, especially given the fact that we're in test season right now, something called stereotype threat. So a lot of times we think about stereotypes as negative, obviously negative, but a negative stereotype. But this is true with positive stereotypes as well. So what stereotype threat is, if I can explain it as succinctly as possible, is if there is a negative stereotype or positive stereotype about you, a group that you belong to, um, being reminded that you are a member of that group can sometimes cause the stereotype to either come true or backfire. So in this study that was done, um, so this is based off of SAT scores. Okay, so just think about that. This is questions about SAT scores. Um, when students were told that this was a academic, or this was a research evaluation, it was a research problem that they had to do. It was not something that was based off of academics or academic ability. You saw that black and white participants scored roughly equal in terms of the items solved, right? So if it was just framed as this is a research opportunity, there's no real stereotype around research, so you don't see any results. But when you frame it instead as that this is an academic evaluation, right? That this is a test to measure academic ability, suddenly the exact same questions show much different results. This is a result of stereotype threat. The way that we think about this is that being reminded that you are a member of a group that has a stereotype against you. In this case, there's a stereotype that Black Americans are less studious or less academically gifted than white Americans. That reminder of being a member of that group prevents that person from performing as well as they normally should. So, in other words, right, it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you think that you're being reminded of your membership in a group, that then has a negative effect just by being reminded of that. So I'm a big proponent of, and I know this because we recently have done the PSATs. They really should put those demographic questions at the end of the test process, not at the beginning. By putting it at the beginning, it's just triggering this stereotype threat for a lot of people. We'll talk more about stereotype threat later in the year when we talk about personality. It shows up again there, and we'll dive into it a little bit more deeply. I have a really good podcast that we'll listen to that talks about stereotype threat, and then actually something that they call stereotype tax, which is a interesting way to frame this. This also relates to discrimination and outgroup bias and things like in our justice system. So there are a number of cases that we can look at. The data pretty much shows exactly the same. So here you have a study where you have someone coming in, they're told that there was a crime committed and you're going to be a juror. If the victim was Black, the more or less stereotypical race of the offender, and those are the pictures there that they used in the study, didn't really matter. The percentage of people who said that there should be a death sentence if depending on the race of the victim, if they're a Black victim, depending on the stereotypical perpetrator, pretty much even. But when you get to a white victim, you actually see a major jump. That the more stereotypical Black face received more death sentences than the less stereotypical Black face. That's a huge problem, right? We have things that we call implicit bias, which we're going to talk about in a second. But that we might not even be aware, right? That's why it's implicit, not explicit. We're not even aware of the biases or the thoughts that we're having. We make these snap judgments and we don't recognize the larger role that society is playing on us. So how does prejudice come about? How does this work? So one theory is that it's based off of social inequalities, that prejudices start as a way to kind of distinguish yourself from other groups, right? So if you have been attacked unfairly, maybe that means that you are going to then start viewing all people that look like the person that attacked you in a negative way. This is one explanation for prejudice, that it just leads to those negative thoughts, right? Those negative feelings about an individual or a group. that you just kind of project that to the whole. Um, from an evolutionary perspective, right? If we can put that hat on for a second, that kind of makes sense, right? Like if something hurt you once, you want to avoid those things in the future. So this is a kind of understandable way that this could happen. The other way that we describe prejudice is through what we call in-group and out-group bias. So in other words, it's the us versus them mentality. So if you have an in-group, whatever that in-group is, whether it's Americans, whether it's wealthy or poor, whether it's male or female, whether it's whatever group that you identify with, you have an implicit tendency automatically to favor your own group. There was this great study done at Yale with babies. And we'll actually watch some of the footage from the study again later in the year. But what they did was they had a baby, and they had a baby choose between I don't remember. I think it was graham crackers or Cheerios as terms of a snack. And then they watched a puppet show where one puppet ate the graham crackers, ate the whatever snack that they chose, and one ate the opposite one. So let's say that the baby chose Cheerios. The blue puppet eats the Cheerios. The yellow puppet eats the graham crackers. Okay. They then watch a scenario where the puppet that ate the graham crackers gets punished. Right. They're trying to like solve a problem and they can't. The babies watch that more. Infants like 6 months old watch that scene more. Than a scene where the same thing happened to the bear of the snack that they chose. They did another version, same thing, right? Snacks, whatever it is, and they watched one bear. So let's say that the bear with the Cheerios sees the bear that ate the graham crackers struggling. If the bear with the Cheerios came over and like prevented the bear or the puppet or whatever it is from the graham crackers from getting what they wanted, then the child almost always picked to play with the puppet that did that harm, right? That they kind of instinctively drew like, oh, this puppet likes the same snacks I do, therefore I'm rooting for that puppet to succeed. I've probably done a really bad job explaining that study, but we see this all the time, right? When all else is pretty much equal, we kind of draw in and out groups, right? Us versus them. Again, evolutionarily speaking, this makes some sense, right? If people are in my group, then I know I can trust them and they're not going to harm me. If I don't know you, then that could cause me, injury or death or something. But when we get into societies and larger societies and pluralistic societies, multicultural societies, this us versus them mentality is actually really dangerous. We know that prejudice can be an expression of anger. So whether that's justified anger or misplaced anger, right? It still can be an expression of anger. You can think of poor white Southerners before the Civil War who were in favor of slavery just because it meant that there were people who were less than they were, and they were angry with the social system that was there. Right, they were angry at the wealthy upper class ruling the way that they did in, let's just say, the colonial Americas, but they're prejudiced because well, at least there's someone else below them on the social scale. We know that cognitively speaking, we like to categorize things. When we understand the world, we like to put things in neat little boxes, and it helps us both with our memory and processing speeds. But sometimes that leads to an oversimplification that can lead us down the road of prejudice, right? Sometimes we do overgeneralize from very simple cases. And that leads us to another idea that comes out of this, which is what's called the just world phenomenon. And basically what this means is that there's a belief that, there we go, look at that. There's a belief that people get what they deserve, right? So here you've got the big fish thinking the world is totally just because it gets to eat whatever it wants. You have the medium fish that thinks, oh, there's some justice in the world because it sometimes it gets eaten, which of course it doesn't want, and sometimes it gets the food. And then the small fish thinks that there's no justice in the world. This was actually done in an experiment. Why is it not going away? This was actually done in an experiment where um, people were uh, observing someone receive shocks. That's what that says behind this thing. I don't know why I can't get that to go away. Um, but people were observing someone receiving shocks, kind of like in the Milgram experiment. They were getting it, they were doing a memories test and they were getting it wrong, and they were watching that person receive shocks. Um, and that person was in on it, and the shocks were fake. But the people watching it later thought that the person who was receiving the shocks, if they could do nothing to intervene, if they had no way of helping, they were just kind of like watching as bystanders. Um, they actually said that she got what she deserved. That she, well, if she didn't want to get shocked, she would have studied harder or something along those lines. Whereas people who had an opportunity to intervene or prevent them from happening actually, did so. They stopped the person from being shocked, or they said that they felt compassion for that person, that it was unfair. So this starts right with this idea that there's an us versus them, right? There's the in group, out group bias. And you start seeing this belief of, oh, people get what they deserve, the world is just and fair. And therefore, if you don't have a lot, that must mean that you are, lazy or hard work, or not hard, lazy, or you have some other issues, or, you're not working as hard as you could in order to to move up the ladder, right? We see this idea of just world phenomenon usually in with wealthier individuals, whether they earn that themselves through ingenious hard work, whatever, or if this was an inherited wealth situation. Um, there's this undercurrent of just world ideas that kind of permeate a lot of our culture, and when you think of it that way, you can kind of see it just as you move throughout the world. So that's kind of the roots of prejudice. That's kind of the psychological explanation. If you have questions, I'm not sure how clear that came across about this. Please let me know in class. Like I said, we'll be talking a lot more about racism and prejudice and stereotypes in class. And I have some videos that we're going to watch as well to help explain things in a deeper way. Um, so that'll be it for this video. We will come back and finish talking about things like aggression, conflict, and then pro-social behavior. Why do we do things to help other people? So we'll start with the negative, and then we'll get to the positive eventually. All right, guys, I will see you next time.